Homo sapiens line descends from a line that goes back about 6 million years, not much further than that, if we accept conventional evolutionary theory. So 6 million years ago, Antarctica is supposed to have been as cold and as frozen as it is today. And there's undoubtedly a time, they found fossils on Antarctica, there's undoubtedly a time when Antarctica was lush and green. The question is, was it lush and green during the lifetime of the human species?
Yes.
Graham Hancock's theories about an ancient civilization in Antarctica are quite intriguing, although they veer significantly from mainstream scientific views. He speculates that a part of this lost advanced civilization was located in what's now the icy expanse of Antarctica. This is a striking thought considering Antarctica's current freezing conditions. He links this to the hypothesis of Earth crust displacement.
The entire outer crust of the Earth, like the skin of an orange, might shift, leaving the core of the Earth in place.
This theory suggests that Antarctica wasn't always at the South Pole, but might have been in a more temperate region, allowing a civilization to thrive. However, it's crucial to note that this idea of Earth crust displacement isn't supported by the current scientific understanding of plate tectonics, which doesn't allow for such rapid and dramatic shifts of the Earth's crust. Hancock also delves into mythology, drawing connections between various global myths, legends, and religious texts. He interprets these as allegorical references to this lost civilization, particularly focusing on stories of great floods or cataclysms. He proposes that such a cataclysm, maybe a flood or a comet impact, led to the downfall of this advanced civilization.
To me, the obvious answer is we are dealing with the fingerprints of a lost civilization that mapped the world and that left evidence of that mapping.
According to his theory, survivors of this catastrophe might have traveled the world, spreading their advanced knowledge, significantly influencing the development of later civilizations like the Egyptians and Sumerians. One of the more fascinating aspects of his theory is how he points out the similarities in architectural structures and astronomical alignments at various ancient sites. He sees these as potential evidence of a shared origin of knowledge, suggesting that this knowledge could have been passed down from the earlier civilization. Hancock believes that this civilization's legacy includes not just advanced architectural techniques and astronomical observations, but potentially other lost technologies and wisdom.
The date that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is built, 11,600 years ago. That, weirdly, is the date that Plato's Timaeus and Critias gives for the submergence of Atlantis.
While his ideas certainly capture the imagination, it's important to remember that they are viewed with skepticism by the scientific community. Antarctica during the Eocene epoch was a completely different world from what we know today. It was actually positioned over the South Pole, just like it is now. But the climate back then was way warmer, allowing for a whole different kind of environment. This was a time when the continents were still shifting around after the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. So Antarctica, which was part of what we call Gondwana, was slowly moving to where it sits now, all isolated at the bottom of the world. This shifting around of continents, like Australia and South America moving away, played a big role in changing ocean currents and the climate. One of the most striking things about Antarctica back then was that it didn't have the massive ice sheet it has today. This absence of ice was mainly because of the much warmer global temperatures at the time. This had a big knock-on effect on the planet's climate, as the reflective ice that sends solar radiation back into space wasn't there, adding to the overall warmth. The tectonic movements during the Eocene were also pretty significant. The breakup of Gondwana was a major event reshaping the layout of the Earth's land and water. A key moment was the opening of the Drake Passage, the stretch of water between Antarctica and South America. This opening was a game-changer because it led to the creation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is a massive ocean current that goes around Antarctica. This current had a huge impact on the climate. It kind of put Antarctica in a climatic bubble, circulating cold water around it and stopping the warmer waters from the north from getting through. This is believed to have played a big part in cooling down Antarctica and leading to the ice-covered continent we know today. As for what life was like back then, the fossil records are really fascinating. They show that Antarctica supported a diverse range of plants and even animals. We're talking about temperate to subtropical forests with beeches, conifers, and ferns. Imagine that in place of today's icy desert. These fossils tell us the climate was much warmer and humid, and then there's the sea level. which was way higher than what we see now because there weren't those big ice caps locking up all that water.
So this is how do you know that sea level rose? There are certain corals that can only exist within a certain number of feet of the sea's surface.
This meant that the coastline and the shape of the land were quite different, and some places that are land now were underwater back then. The warmer temperatures and higher sea levels would have made the marine life around Antarctica rich and diverse, very different from what's there now. The Eocene epoch, which lasted from about 56 to 34 million years ago, was a really interesting time in Earth's history. It was part of this bigger period called the Paleogene period, and it's a part of what scientists call the Cenozoic era. This era is often nicknamed the Age of Mammals because it's when mammals started to diversify a lot, especially after the dinosaurs had their big exit at the end of the Cretaceous period. During the Eocene, the world's continents were on the move, drifting towards where they are now. This movement was a big deal because it changed how ocean currents flowed and affected the climate in a bunch of ways. Now, one of the most dramatic things about the Eocene was this event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This happened around 56 million years ago, and it was a time when the Earth got really warm, really fast. Temperatures shot up by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in just a few thousand years. Scientists think this might have been because of a ton of methane being released from the ocean floor. This warming had a huge impact on life on Earth. In the oceans, some species went extinct, while on land, mammals started to evolve and diversify like crazy. The levels of CO2 in the atmosphere were also way higher than what we have today. Estimates say it was between 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million, which is a lot compared to the pre-industrial level of about 280 ppm. This high level of CO2 came from things like volcanic activity, burning of organic matter, and because natural carbon sinks weren't as effective. One of the big differences between the Eocene and now was that there were no major ice sheets at the poles. This is really different from today, where we've got big ice caps in both the Arctic and Antarctic. Because the Earth was so much warmer, the temperature difference between the equator and the poles wasn't as extreme as it is now. As a result, the polar regions were much warmer than they are today. And because there was less ice, sea levels were higher. This means a lot of water that's currently frozen in ice was in the ocean back then. This affected marine life a lot, changing where different species lived and leading to the development of new types of marine ecosystems.
One of the things I find most striking is the presence of Antarctica on ancient maps, because we didn't discover it until 1820.
Now, Graham has a really fascinating theory about an ancient advanced civilization that he believes existed long before the civilizations we commonly recognize, like the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. His idea pushes the timeline of advanced human societies back tens of thousands of years, possibly even to the last ice age. This is a huge leap from the established historical understanding, which generally sees complex societies and civilizations emerging more recently. Hancock points to the incredible architectural feats of ancient megalithic structures like those at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Stonehenge in England, and various sites in Egypt and Mesoamerica. He sees these as evidence of a highly advanced architectural knowledge. Moreover, he talks about the astronomical precision of these structures. For instance, how the Great Pyramids of Giza align with the stars of Orion's belt, or how Stonehenge aligns with the solstices and equinoxes. These aren't just random placements. They suggest a deep understanding of the stars and seasons. He also believes this civilization had impressive navigational skills, which might explain how similar architectural and astronomical concepts appeared across different continents. But it's not just about the buildings and their alignments with celestial events. Hancock thinks these ancient monuments reflect a comprehensive knowledge of astronomy that was integrated into the culture and religious practices of the time. He also suggests evidence of sophisticated urban planning in ancient ruins, indicating a level of societal organization and city-building knowledge that's not typically credited to prehistoric societies. Then there's the idea of a global spread of knowledge. Hancock theorizes that the similarities in architectural styles and astronomical knowledge across various ancient cultures around the world point to a common, advanced source of knowledge. This knowledge could have been spread by the survivors of this ancient society. Graham Hancock's theory really takes a global perspective when it comes to the influence of this ancient, advanced civilization he proposes. He thinks that this civilization had a major impact all over the world. It's not just a localized phenomenon, but something that reached across continents. According to him, we can see traces of this civilization in the myths, architectural designs, and astronomical knowledge of many different ancient cultures. He's suggesting that there's a kind of cultural diffusion that took place from this lost civilization to later societies. So when we see similar styles in buildings or common themes in religious beliefs and astronomical practices across various ancient cultures, he interprets this as evidence of their influence. He goes further to speculate that after some huge disaster that brought this civilization down, the survivors might have spread out to different areas of the world. These survivors, he believes, were the ones who passed on their advanced knowledge, and this played a crucial role in the development of the civilizations we know about from history, like the Egyptians and Sumerians. Now, when it comes to evidence, Hancock looks at archaeological sites and findings that he feels mainstream archaeology hasn't been able to fully explain. He talks about structures that, to him, seem like they needed pretty advanced engineering or astronomical know-how to build. He also dives into ancient texts and myths, interpreting them not just as stories or legends, but as allegorical records of real historical events. Think of tales about great floods or lost lands like Atlantis. Hancock sees these as collective memories of the lost civilization. He also notes that there are these cross-cultural similarities, like how myths from different parts of the world seem to share common themes, or how architectural styles and astronomical knowledge seem to echo each other even across cultures that supposedly never interacted. To Hancock, this points to a shared older source of knowledge.
So this, if it were true, and it is true, would put the Sphinx back to a much earlier period, which would tie in with Schwaller's work and John Anthony West's subsequent work, that there were indications that dynastic Egypt as we know it, going back to about 3000 BC, was really a legacy of what I call now an earlier cycle of civilization.
Robert M. Schoch, a geologist with a PhD from Yale University, came up with a fascinating idea in the 1990s about the age of the Great Sphinx of Giza. He noticed something interesting about the erosion patterns on the Sphinx and the surrounding area. Unlike the typical wind and sand erosion you'd expect in Egypt's deserts, these patterns looked more like they were caused by water. This was a big deal because it suggested that the Sphinx might be much older than we thought. Now, Graham Hancock, a well-known British author who loves digging into ancient mysteries, found Schoch's theory really interesting and started supporting it.
Since the early 1990s, question marks have been raised over the age of the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt. Egyptologists think it's about 4,500 years old, although there's not a shred of inscription evidence to support this date. Independent researcher John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, professor of geology at Boston University, have made a case that the Sphinx must be much older than that.
Hancock is known for questioning the usual stories we hear about historical and archaeological sites. Schoch's theory caught his eye because it suggested that the Sphinx was around during a time when Egypt had a lot of rain, which was way back around 8,000 to 10,000 BCE. This idea of heavy rainfall leading to the erosion we see on the Sphinx today is really cool, but also quite controversial. You see, traditionally, archaeologists have dated the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE, during Pharaoh Khafre's time. They base this on where the Sphinx is located in the Giza pyramid complex and how it looks compared to other stuff from that period. But if Schoch is right and the Sphinx was actually built when it was much wetter in Egypt, then it could be thousands of years older than we thought, maybe even dating back to the Neolithic era. That's a pretty big shake-up in how we think about ancient Egyptian history.
To put it bluntly, the Sphinx did not originate with Khafre in the 4th dynasty, and really the beginning of my serious work and career looking at ancient civilizations.
Instead of the typical wear and tear you'd expect from wind and sand in a desert, the Sphinx had features like deep cracks, wavy lines on its limestone walls, and smooth, rounded edges. These are the kinds of things you usually see with water erosion, not wind or sand. Now, the Sphinx is made out of limestone, which is pretty easy for water to wear down. And what's interesting is that this limestone is made up of different layers, some harder than others. Schoch saw that the water erosion affected these layers in a way that you wouldn't really see if it was just wind and sand doing the damage. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Schoch looked at the climate history of the Sahara Desert and the Giza area and found out that way back between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, This place wasn't the dry desert we know today. It was actually pretty wet, thanks to something called the Neolithic subpluvial phase.
We know there were ultra-hyper-arid Sahara conditions on the Giza Plateau for the last 5,000 or so years. And this ties in with the origins of civilization, according to the standard story, which is that civilization began between 4,000 and 3,000 BCE.
This was a time when there was a lot more rain. So Schoch thinks that this rainy period might have caused the kind of water erosion we see on the Sphinx, suggesting it's much older than we thought, maybe even dating back to these wetter times. This goes against the usual dating of the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE during Pharaoh Khafre's reign, based on its style and where it's located in the Giza pyramid complex. Schoch's idea definitely shakes things up in terms of how we think about the Sphinx's age. So Robert Schoch didn't just look at the Sphinx in isolation when he was thinking about this whole water erosion idea. He actually compared the wear and tear on the Sphinx with other ancient limestone sites that had been exposed to a lot of rain. This was his way of checking if what he saw on the Sphinx matched up with known patterns of water erosion elsewhere. It's like looking at different worn-out jeans to figure out if they got ripped from climbing trees or just from washing them a lot. He found sites with a clear historical background where they knew for sure that rain had done its thing over the years. When he looked at these places, he noticed that the erosion patterns were quite similar to what he was seeing on the Sphinx. This kind of bolstered his argument that the erosion on the Sphinx could really be from water, not just wind or sand.
You look at the evidence, and that's really where I was coming from. But my point is that even in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I first got involved with this, if I looked at it critically, the evidence was not that definitive for the age of the Sphinx.
Schoch's approach was pretty comprehensive. He wasn't just a geologist looking at rocks. He was also considering the weather patterns from thousands of years ago and what archaeologists were saying about these ancient sites. It's like he was piecing together a big jigsaw puzzle from different fields of study. But of course, there are always different sides to a story. Some critics pointed out that the erosion could be due to other natural processes unique to the Giza area, like fluctuations in groundwater, or the way certain chemicals in the air might wear down the rock. And then there's the whole thing about what archaeologists have found around the Sphinx, like artifacts and writings that suggest it was built around 2500 BCE, during Pharaoh Khafre's time. This kind of goes against Schoch's idea that the Sphinx is way older because of the water erosion. So it's a bit of a puzzle with some pieces still missing. Graham Hancock has this really intriguing idea about an ancient civilization that he thinks existed way before the ones we usually learn about in history books, like the Egyptians, Sumerians, and the Indus Valley folks. He reckons this civilization was around many millennia earlier, and that it might have been wiped out by a huge comet impact around 10,000 BCE. Imagine that a whole advanced society just gone in the blink of an eye, leaving only bits and pieces behind. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Hancock thinks this civilization wasn't just hanging out in one spot, it was all over the place, having a global influence. He suggests that after whatever disaster hit them, the survivors might have traveled far and wide, sharing their knowledge and helping kickstart other ancient cultures. Hancock dives into myths and oral traditions from all over the world too. He's not just dismissing these stories as old wives' tales, but considering them as potential historical records. For example, he's really interested in the flood myths that pop up in different cultures. He thinks these might be a collective memory of a real event that had a huge impact on this lost civilization.
The best explanation is that floods of icy meltwater released by the heat and kinetic energy of the impacts flowed off the North American ice cap and into the Atlantic Ocean, where they interrupted the Gulf Stream, a key element of the central heating system of our planet, hence the sudden and dramatic cooling.
Now, Hancock is big on astronomy. He points to how some ancient structures, like the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, line up with certain stars and constellations. He thinks this isn't just a coincidence, but a sign of advanced astronomical knowledge. He's also into the idea that these ancient folks understood the precession of the equinoxes. That's a fancy term for a slow shift in Earth's rotation over a 26,000-year cycle. If he's right, it means they were way ahead of their time in understanding the cosmos. Graham Hancock has this captivating theory about ancient civilizations and their architectural wonders. He's really into how these old structures, like the pyramids in Egypt, Stonehenge, and those incredible megalithic sites in South America, show off some serious engineering and architectural skills. Hancock reckons that to build these things with such precision and detail, those ancient folks must have had some advanced knowledge and technology that we don't usually give them credit for. Take, for instance, the way the stones are cut at Pumapunku in Bolivia. Hancock points out that the cuts are so precise, it's as if they had access to some really advanced tools. And when it comes to building massive structures, he's all about the techniques they must have used. He's amazed at how accurately these huge stones were fitted together, often without any mortar, and wonders how on earth they moved and positioned stones that weigh several tons. This isn't just your everyday heavy lifting. We're talking about some serious know-how in engineering and possibly some clever uses of leverage and pulley systems. Now he doesn't stop there. He's also fascinated by the mathematical and geometrical knowledge that these structures reveal. He talks about the use of the golden ratio, pi, and precise angular measurements, which shows a sophisticated understanding of math and geometry. Like, take the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Its alignment, the way its base is perfectly level, and the precise angles of its sides. Hancock sees this as evidence of a much more advanced understanding of geometry and engineering than we might think. Then there are the monumental buildings in Mesoamerica, such as the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan and the Mayan pyramids. Hancock highlights their architectural sophistication, urban planning, and the use of large stone blocks. All of this, to him, points to a level of technological proficiency and knowledge that goes way beyond what we've traditionally thought was possible for these ancient cultures. In a nutshell, Hancock is looking at these ancient structures and saying, hey, there's more to the story here. He's suggesting that these civilizations had a depth of knowledge and skill in construction, engineering, and mathematics that challenges our conventional understanding of ancient history.
It wasn't something the Maya made up. The Olmecs used that same symbolism. So the Mayan calendar is actually an Olmec calendar. And if we then consider the possibility that the Olmecs may just be the latest, the earliest surviving manifestation of that calendar, it could go back.
Then there's Teotihuacan in Mexico. Hancock looks at the layout of this ancient city and sees a kind of mirror image of our solar system's planetary orbits. To him, this suggests that the people who built Teotihuacan had a pretty detailed knowledge of astronomy and space. Stonehenge in England is another example. Hancock thinks it was used as an astronomical observatory because of how it aligns with the solstices. He sees this as further evidence that ancient people understood celestial movements really well. And let's not forget about the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. During the equinoxes, this pyramid casts a shadow that looks like a serpent. Hancock sees this as a sophisticated way of tracking the sun's path, again showing an advanced understanding of astronomy. Hancock also dives into the idea of precession, which is this slow wobble in Earth's rotation that takes about 26,000 years to go full circle. He looks at how the Giza pyramids align with Orion's belt, and how the Sphinx lines up with the Leo constellation during what's known as the Age of Leo, around 10,500 BCE. He thinks these alignments aren't random but deliberate, showing that the people back then understood this complex astronomical phenomenon. So, in a nutshell, Hancock is really into the idea that ancient structures around the world weren't just built for the heck of it. He believes they were deliberately aligned with stars, constellations, and celestial events, showing that ancient civilizations had a much deeper understanding of astronomy than we usually give them credit for.
If you mention the word Atlantis to any archaeologist, they will tend to roll their eyes.
The fittingly named Eye of the Sahara is by far the most likely location for the lost capital city of Atlantis.
When you look at all of the areas around the planet that have been proposed for Atlantis, I think there's one place that fits the majority of his details, and that's the sunken Azores Plateau.
The Reichat structure, often referred to as the Eye of the Sahara, is a remarkable and unique geological formation with some fascinating features. Spanning about 40 kilometers in diameter, it's so large that it can be easily spotted from space. The structure isn't a perfect circle, but rather takes on a slightly elliptical dome shape, adding to its mystique. One of the most striking aspects of the Reichat structure is its series of concentric rings. These rings are quite intriguing because they're not all the same. They vary in terms of their width, what they're made of, and how they've eroded over time. This creates a complex, layered look that's quite captivating.
The rim rock of this is late Cretaceous, about 90 million years old. So at that point, it was below the ocean, right? So it's been uplifted. I think this thing is about 1,400 or 1,500 feet above sea level. So it's been eroded. You see, this whole thing here is like an erosion.
The way these rings have formed is a tale of erosion at work. Over millions of years, forces of nature like wind and water have eroded the dome, unveiling these distinct rings. Each layer of the structure erodes differently, depending on how tough or soft it is, which is why we see this range of rings. Now let's talk about what the Richat structure is made of, because it's quite a mix. The outer rings are primarily made of something called Proterozoic quartzite. This is a very hard rock that's resistant to weathering, and it's incredibly old. We're talking over 600 million years. Quartzite forms from sandstone that's been put under a lot of heat and pressure, so it's been through a lot. As we move towards the inner rings, the story changes. Here we find softer sedimentary rocks like limestone and sandstone. Limestone, primarily composed of calcium carbonate, typically forms in old marine environments. Sandstone, on the other hand, is made up of sand-like mineral particles. Right at the center, the Richat structure has something called siliceous breccia, which is basically a bunch of angular rock fragments stuck together. Breccia usually forms in areas with lots of volcanic activity, or where the Earth's crust has been moving and shaking. All these different rock types in one place make the Richat structure quite special. Not only is it a visually stunning landmark, but it's also a valuable spot for geologists to study.
So the connection to ancient Egypt that Solon draws and Plato passes on is actually very real. It's very solid. And I'm pleased to say that there has now been a full translation of the Edfu text.
When it comes to how the Richat structure was formed, there are a couple of theories floating around. The most widely accepted one is what geologists call the uplifted dome theory. In simple terms, this theory suggests that natural forces beneath the Earth's surface pushed up layers of rock, creating a sort of bulge on the surface. Over time, this dome was worn down by erosion, which is basically the wind and water gradually wearing away the rock. This erosion didn't happen uniformly. The softer rocks wore down faster than the harder ones, leading to the formation of those distinctive concentric rings we see today. Now, there's another, more speculative theory proposed by Jimmy Corsetti. He's got this interesting idea that the near-perfect circular shape and unique layering of the Richat structure might not be all natural. He thinks that ancient human activities might have played a part in shaping it.
The circular ring city was also said to have an opening to the sea at the south, which not only matches the southerly opening of the Richat anomaly, but it even has existing evidence of a flow of salt water that is still visible to this day.
The environment of the Sahara Desert has also played a significant role in the process of the Richat structure formation. The dry, arid conditions mean that wind erosion is particularly influential in shaping the structure. And let's not forget that the Sahara hasn't always been a desert. It has gone through various climatic changes over millions of years, and these changes have influenced the rate and nature of erosion in the region. Some of the rocks there are incredibly old, dating back to over 600 million years ago. This period covers a huge chunk of our planet's past, from about 2.5 billion to 541 million years ago. It's a crucial era for understanding how continents formed and how early life evolved. Now, imagine the amount of time it took to form the Richat structure. It's been shaped over millions and millions of years. A lot of factors played a role in shaping the Richat structure. Movements in the Earth's crust, like the shifting of tectonic plates, have been a big part of it. Then there's the impact of climate changes over the ages, especially in the Sahara region. All these changes influenced the patterns of erosion that gave the structure its current look. And speaking of erosion, it's been the main force sculpting and exposing the different layers of rock in the Richat structure. One of the coolest things about the Richat structure is its distinct circular pattern. As said before, it's so noticeable that astronauts use it as a landmark when they're up in space. This pattern really stands out against the surrounding desert landscape.
If you take the concept of Atlantis seriously, you're regarded by archaeologists and their friends in the media as a kind of lunatic. And I've always found this odd because the source, the earliest surviving source for the tradition of Atlantis, is the highly respected figure of Plato.
Plato's description of Atlantis, found in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, really captures the imagination, doesn't it? Written around 360 BC, these works come from a time when Athens was at the height of its philosophical and cultural influence. Plato was a thinker who loved to dive deep into ideas about society, morality, and reality, and he used these dialogues as a way to explore these themes. It's kind of like he was having a conversation through his characters, which let him present different ideas and arguments. Now, about Atlantis itself, it's described as this massive island city located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which most people think is the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato went all out in describing it as bigger than Libya and Asia combined, which really paints a picture of its mythical size. The city layout is fascinating, with these concentric circles of land and water. Imagine the engineering it would have taken to build something like that in ancient times, complete with canals and bridges connecting everything. The heart of the island, its central plain, was said to be super fertile, perfect for farming, and it was surrounded by high mountains rich in resources and natural protection. And Atlantis wasn't just about impressive landscapes, it was also a hub of resources and technology. Plato talks about it having all sorts of metals, including this mysterious orichalcum as well as gold and silver. The infrastructure was top-notch, with water systems, temples, palaces, and docks. But Atlantis wasn't just about buildings and resources. Plato describes it as having a complex society with its own laws, customs, and political organization. It even had a powerful military. Yet in his story, Atlantis starts as this ideal place and then becomes corrupt and ultimately falls.
Plato includes precise scientific information in the story. And this is what archaeology is ignoring when it says that it's all a fantastical made-up tale. And it's to do with that meltwater pulse 1b that I mentioned, that brought the Younger Dryas to an end 11,600 years ago and raised sea levels massively.
Now let's talk about the theory connecting the Rishat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, to the legendary city of Atlantis, as described by Plato. It's quite a fascinating topic, especially the ideas presented by Jimmy Corsetti. Here's where it gets interesting. Corsetti and some others have pointed out that these rings bear a striking resemblance to Plato's Atlantis, which in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias was described as having similar concentric circles of land and water. Now, while geologists understand these rings in the Rishat structure as a result of natural erosion processes, the similarity to the mythical Atlantis has sparked quite a bit of interest and speculation. When you compare the size of the Rishat structure to what Plato described for Atlantis, there seem to be some parallels, although there are notable differences in the exact measurements. Corsetti's theory even suggests that changes like erosion over time could have altered the Rishat structure's appearance, possibly bringing it closer to what Plato described. But here's a major twist in the tale. The Rishat structure is smack in the middle of the Sahara Desert, while Plato's Atlantis was described as an island in the Atlantic Ocean. This stark difference in geographical context has led to some interesting speculation. Some theorists propose that the landscape around the Rishat structure might have been very different in the past, possibly closer to water, or even more hospitable than the Sahara we know today.
And he's shown writings on the walls by the priests. And he says, what do these writings say? And the priests then unravel the whole story of Atlantis, and they tell how there was this great advanced civilization, which at one time was extremely beneficial and positive to the world, but which fell out of harmony with the universe.
The Eye of the Sahara is quite an archaeological goldmine. In this particular region, a variety of artifacts have been found, shedding light on the lives of people who lived there thousands of years ago. We're talking about stone tools like arrowheads, scrapers, and axes that were probably used for hunting and crafting. These tools tell us a lot about the daily activities and skills of these ancient folks. Then there's the pottery. Finding fragments of pottery in the area is like getting a glimpse into their domestic life. It shows that they had developed pottery-making skills, which is a big deal in understanding the cultural and technological progress of any civilization. And you know what's even more intriguing? There are hints of more permanent forms of settlement. Although it's not definitive, the remnants of structures could mean that these were not just nomadic people passing through, but a community that settled down. But here's where it gets really interesting: the rock paintings and engravings. These are found on cliff faces and in caves right around the Rishat structure. The artwork is not just beautiful, it's like a storybook of ancient life. There are paintings of animals like antelopes, elephants, and giraffes, suggesting a time when the Sahara was teeming with wildlife. Then there are human figures depicted in various activities, giving us a sneak peek into their social and cultural practices, and the symbols and abstract designs might even point to their spiritual beliefs. Dating these rock arts can be tricky, but many are believed to be from the Neolithic period. This suggests that the region had a thriving community during that era. It's not just about finding old stuff, it's about piecing together the story of human habitation and development in the area. The presence of these artifacts and artworks indicates that there was a stable human population at some point. The possibility of permanent settlements, while not confirmed, is certainly tantalizing and calls for more extensive archaeological research. These findings are like puzzle pieces that help us understand the prehistoric Sahara, which was once a greener, more hospitable place than it is today. They tell a story of human adaptation and migration, of how people responded to the climatic changes that turned the Sahara into the desert we know now. It's not just about the history of a particular region, it's about adding to the rich tapestry of African prehistory and understanding the diversity and complexity of early human societies on the continent. Isn't it amazing how much we can learn about our past from the things left behind in the sands of time?
The Amazon basin is 7 million square kilometers in area. And within it, 5.5 million square kilometers remains almost entirely unstudied by archaeologists. We've done world archaeology, but we've just ignored the Amazon. What we find in the Amazon are thousands of henges that are now beginning to emerge from the cleared area of the jungle, and others that have been identified for the first time with LiDAR.
Discoveries of ancient civilizations in the Amazon jungle have unveiled a complex and sophisticated history that challenges previous assumptions about the region. These discoveries, made through a combination of aerial surveys, satellite imagery, and ground expeditions, reveal the existence of large, well-planned urban settlements, extensive road networks, and advanced agricultural techniques, suggesting a much higher level of social organization and environmental management than previously thought. The Cuhicugu complex in the Upper Xingu region of the Brazilian Amazon offers an incredible glimpse into the advanced urban planning and societal organization of pre-Columbian civilizations, long before European contact. Nestled in the remote Amazon basin in present-day Mato Grosso, Brazil, this area is a treasure trove of biodiversity. The dense rainforests and network of rivers likely played a key role in the development and sustenance of this complex society. Covering about 50 square kilometers, the Cuhicugu complex is home to over 20 settlements. These aren't just randomly placed, they're strategically positioned to make the most of the region's natural resources. What's fascinating is how these settlements are connected. Imagine a series of straight roads, some stretching for several kilometers, laid out with such precision that they often align with the cardinal directions. This not only facilitated travel, but also shows a high level of planning and coordination. Then there's the canal system, an impressive display of hydraulic engineering, likely used for everything from transportation to water management, and maybe even fish farming. The variety of structures within the complex is equally remarkable. From large public buildings and ceremonial spaces to individual homes, the architecture reflects a hierarchy in building techniques, hinting at different social or functional roles within the society. And speaking of society, estimates suggest that at its peak, Cuhicugu could have supported a whopping 30,000 to 50,000 people. This is deduced from the sheer number of residential structures and the expanse of agricultural land.
Along the Amazon, he reported seeing incredible cities, advanced arts and crafts, millions of people, a thriving culture.
The rediscovery of the Cuhicugu complex in the Amazon is a fascinating story that blends modern technology with traditional archaeology. Initially, this hidden gem was revealed through aerial surveys and satellite images. Imagine flying over the dense Amazon rainforest and suddenly spotting the outlines of an ancient civilization. Then, archaeologists like Michael Heckenberger and his team took over, conducting extensive ground excavations. They employed advanced techniques like LiDAR, which is like X-ray vision for archaeologists, to see through the forest canopy and map the area accurately. Now let's talk about how old this place is. Using carbon dating, a method to tell the age of artifacts and soil, scientists figured out that people lived in the Cuhicugu complex for several centuries, dating back to as early as 800 AD. They found all sorts of things like pottery, stone tools, and ornaments, giving us a glimpse into the daily life and creativity of the people who lived there. Here's the kicker. Before finding Kuhikugu, many thought the Amazon was mostly an untouched wilderness before Europeans arrived. But this discovery turned that idea on its head, showing that the area was home to a large and complex society. It's like finding a hidden chapter of history in your backyard. This place shows us that humans had a big impact on the Amazon, way earlier than we thought. They even made their own super fertile soil called terra preta, which is still rich and productive today. What's really cool about Kuhikugu is how it shows that the people there knew how to live sustainably. They had advanced farming practices, managed water well, and lived in harmony with their environment. It's like they were eco-friendly before it was trendy. This discovery also made us rethink the role of indigenous societies in the Amazon. It turns out they knew a lot about how to manage the land and shape the landscape. It's a reminder of how important it is to value and learn from indigenous knowledge. And lastly, the biodiversity in the Amazon today might partly be thanks to these ancient civilizations. The variety of plants near these archaeological sites is way more than in other areas of the forest.
The Amazon is basically a garden. The Amazon is a man-made rainforest. There are certain trees like Brazil nut trees or the ice cream bean tree, which are food crops, which are very, very valuable.
Marajo Island at the Amazon River's mouth is like a time capsule that takes us back to the Marajoara culture, a sophisticated civilization from around 800 to 1400 CE. Imagine an island almost as big as Switzerland, right at the meeting point of a river and the ocean. This place, with its mix of forests, savannas, and wetlands, is not just big but also incredibly diverse. It's the perfect backdrop for the Marajoara people to thrive, providing everything from food to resources for their unique lifestyle. Now, the Marajoara culture is something special. They were known for their artistic flair, especially their ceramics. Picture pots and plates with intricate designs, complex patterns, and images of animals and people. They weren't just making these for fun. Their ceramics were a big part of their culture and beliefs, like the large, beautifully decorated urns they used for burials. These suggest they had quite complex ideas about life, death, and everything in between. But it's not just their art that's fascinating. They built these massive earthen mounds, some over 10 meters high. Think about that. That's like stacking 3 buses on top of each other. These mounds were probably used for everything from homes to ceremonial sites, and might have even protected them from the frequent floods. This shows they were pretty savvy engineers and architects, adapting to their challenging environment in style. The way they organized their society was also quite something. It seems there was a clear hierarchy, with some people leading the way in managing resources and religious practices. And they had different roles for men and women, which we can figure out from the things they left behind. Now let's talk about their farming skills. They were ahead of their time, creating raised fields to keep their crops safe from flooding. Their diet was a mix of what they grew, along with fish and game from the surrounding area. And they were smart about managing water with their canals and ditches, which was pretty crucial in a place that floods a lot. Santarém, right where the Tapajos meets the Amazon River, is a fascinating place, especially when you think about its history. This spot was like the Grand Central Station of its time, bustling with trade and culture. Picture boats coming in and out, carrying all sorts of goods and ideas from different parts of South America. The area around Santarém was rich in resources, which helped the settlement thrive. Now, the people of Santarém were known for their incredible pottery. We're talking about really intricate designs here, geometric patterns, pictures of people and animals, and even mythical beings. The level of detail in these pots and plates is just mind-blowing. And it wasn't just about looking good. These designs tell us a lot about their culture and beliefs. The way they made this pottery was pretty advanced too. They had techniques for molding, firing, and painting that were way ahead of their time. The variety of colors and the way they used glazes show they really knew their stuff when it came to chemistry and kiln construction. It's like they were the master chefs of pottery, knowing exactly how to cook up the perfect piece. Santarém was more than just a local market. It was a cultural hub. The different styles and motifs in the pottery suggest they were mixing it up with all sorts of cultures. And it wasn't just goods they were trading. They were probably swapping stories, ideas, and practices too. The town itself, from what we can tell from the ruins, was pretty well organized. They had different areas for living, working, and probably for community gatherings or ceremonies. It's like they had their own little urban planning going on. But back to the pottery, it's not just about how it was made, but what it tells us about the people of Santarém. It gives us a peek into their daily lives, what they valued, and how they connected with others. The geoglyphs in the Amazon, especially in the Brazilian states of Acre and Rondônia, are like a secret world that's been hidden under the dense forest canopy for centuries. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, mostly because of deforestation, that these incredible earthworks started to come to light, thanks to technology like satellite imagery and LiDAR, which is basically like having X-ray vision from space. Over 450 of these geoglyphs have been mapped. This discovery has completely changed our view of how people lived in the Amazon before Columbus. Now, these aren't just a few lines in the dirt. We're talking about huge designs that can stretch over a kilometer and cover several square kilometers. They come in all sorts of shapes: circles, squares, rectangles, and more intricate forms. Some even have patterns like radial spokes, which add to their complexity. The sheer size of these geoglyphs hints at a society that was really well organized and could bring together a lot of people to create these massive works. But how did they make them? Well, they would remove the top layer of soil and vegetation, revealing the lighter-colored earth underneath. This contrast made the design stand out when viewed from above. It seems like they used a variety of tools made from materials like stone, bone, and wood. The level of precision in these geoglyphs shows they were not only skilled, but also had serious planning chops. Some of these geoglyphs line up with astronomical events, like the solstices and equinoxes. This suggests they might have been used for tracking celestial events or for ceremonial or religious purposes. Imagine large groups of people gathering at these geoglyphs for festivals or rituals. It must have been quite a sight. But here's the really cool part. These geoglyphs tell us that the societies in the Amazon before Europeans arrived were much more complex than we thought. They could modify their environment on a large scale and had a social structure where leaders could organize big projects. And despite the size of these geoglyphs, they were made in a way that respected and integrated with the surrounding landscape. So discovering these geoglyphs has really turned our understanding of the Amazon's history on its head. It's no longer seen as just a vast, untouched wilderness, but as a place where complex, organized societies lived and actively shaped their world. It's a reminder of how much history there is still to uncover and how much we can learn from it.
But before the Aztecs and before the Maya, there were a culture who are referred to as the Olmecs. The settlement story of the Americas is much more complicated than we've realized. And what the DNA is doing is it's telling us that there was something really weird.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a growing fascination with ancient civilizations, particularly in the Victorian era. This interest was driven by a mix of cultural trends in exploration, colonization, and a certain romantic allure attached to discovering lost cultures. Major institutions like museums and universities, primarily in Europe and the US, started funding expeditions to unearth ancient artifacts and understand the history of indigenous civilizations in the Americas. It was a time when archaeology began to evolve from just hunting for treasures to a more scientific approach, focusing on careful excavation and detailed analysis.
One of the things I've realized is that there is no classic Native American feature, that Native Americans are have a very complex genetic story with very many different elements brought into it, and we shouldn't be necessarily surprised by the supposedly non-Native American look.
Interestingly, during this period, many artifacts, especially the colossal heads and stone structures found in the Olmec region, were often wrongly attributed to other well-known civilizations like the Maya or Aztec. This was largely because the unique aspects of Olmec art and iconography weren't immediately recognized, partly due to a lack of an overall framework to understand the region's history before Columbus. A couple of notable explorers, John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood, played a significant role in stirring up interest in Mesoamerican cultures with their explorations and writings, particularly their books on travels in Central America and Yucatan. Their detailed accounts and illustrations captured the public's imagination, sparking a wave of interest in these ancient cultures. While they mainly focused on the Maya, Their approach to systematically document their findings and blend travel narratives with scholarly observations greatly influenced future archaeologists studying Mesoamerica.
It's been known by archaeologists for quite a long time that there are anomalous skulls in parts of Brazil, which appear to show very strongly Polynesian or African features, very much like the features that we see on the Olmec heads.
Around this time, there was also a trend in comparative archaeology, where discoveries from different parts of the world were compared, helping to place Mesoamerican civilizations in a global context. Museums began to transition from just storing artifacts to becoming centers of research and education, playing a crucial role in spreading knowledge about ancient cultures. This era also marked the start of interdisciplinary approaches in archaeology, integrating fields like anthropology, linguistics, and early forms of environmental science. This broader, more inclusive approach helped in piecing together a more comprehensive understanding of ancient civilizations, including the intriguing and complex Olmec culture. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when Western archaeologists were exploring Mesoamerica, they started coming across these massive stone heads. Some of them were over 9 feet tall and weighed several tons, with distinctive features like flat noses and fleshy cheeks, often adorned with helmet-like headgear. But here's the thing. Despite their impressive size and unique features, their true cultural significance wasn't immediately understood.
They're most famous for is these huge carved human heads, which can be on a scale of up to 20 to 25 tons, which have curious features which have been interpreted variously as Polynesian, African, don't look like classic Native American features.
One of the earliest significant findings was made by José Melgari Serrano in 1862 at Tres Zapotes in Veracruz. He unearthed what we now know as one of the first Olmec colossal heads. Melgari Serrano even described the head as having Ethiopian features, which tells us a lot about the perceptions and biases of that era. But, and this is crucial, his discovery didn't really spark a broader understanding of the Olmec culture right away. For a long time, these heads were seen more as intriguing oddities rather than pieces of a larger cultural puzzle. It took several decades and a lot more digging before the significance of these heads truly began to be appreciated. Initially, many people thought these artifacts might belong to other known civilizations, like the Maya or Aztec, because the idea of the Olmecs being a distinct, early Mesoamerican civilization hadn't quite taken shape yet. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, with more systematic excavations led by archaeologists like Matthew Stirling, that the true picture began to emerge. They found more colossal heads and other artifacts, and this really helped to establish the Olmecs as a significant and influential civilization in their own right, predating and possibly even influencing others like the Maya and the Aztecs. Back in 1945, a really important expedition took place, led by this guy named Matthew Stirling. He and his team headed to San Lorenzo, right in the heart of what was once Olmec territory. This wasn't just any random adventure. It was a big deal because the Smithsonian Institution was backing it. They saw the potential in figuring out more about the Olmec sites, which could really shed some light on Mesoamerican prehistory. Before Stirling got there, there had been some poking around in the area, mostly because people kept finding these huge stone heads. These finds were intriguing but didn't quite give the full picture. So enter Stirling. He was already pretty well known in archaeology circles and had a real knack for Mesoamerican cultures. He was the perfect guy to take on such a complex task. Now, it wasn't an easy job. The San Lorenzo site was in this tropical area, covered in thick jungle. Just getting to the site and starting to dig was a huge challenge. They had to clear a bunch of jungle without messing up any artifacts that might be hiding there. And let me tell you, the weather didn't make things any easier. It was humid, unpredictable, and not the best for keeping ancient artifacts in one piece. The site itself was huge, spreading out over several kilometers. Stirling and his team had to figure out where to start digging because there was no way they could cover the whole area. They did an initial survey which took a lot of time and planning, and then decided on the most promising spots to start excavating. They had to be super careful with how they dug things up. The artifacts were old and fragile, especially with the humidity. Plus, they had to keep track of everything they found, where they found it, and all the details, which was crucial for understanding the site later on.
It wasn't something the Maya made up. The Olmecs used that same symbolism. So the Mayan calendar is actually an Olmec calendar.
What they found at San Lorenzo was amazing. It turned out to be one of the oldest big cities in Mesoamerica, dating way back to around 1200 to 900 BCE. That's even before civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs that most people are familiar with. The artifacts they unearthed, especially those massive stone heads, were a big deal. They were carved from single blocks of basalt and had all these unique facial features. It was clear that the people who made them were incredibly skilled. All this hard work at San Lorenzo really helped piece together the story of the Olmecs. It gave us a clearer timeline and showed just how complex and advanced their society was. Diving deeper into San Lorenzo, which is super important when it comes to understanding the Olmec civilization, it's considered the oldest major city in Mesoamerica, dating back to around 1200 to 900 BCE. That's way before other famous civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs. Radiocarbon dating was key here. It helped archaeologists nail down the timeline of the site, giving a much clearer picture of when the Olmecs were doing their thing. Now, the most famous stuff they found at San Lorenzo. Definitely the colossal heads. These huge sculptures were carved from single basalt blocks and are known for their unique facial features like almond-shaped eyes and broad noses. A lot of them have these intricate headdresses too, which might have been a sign of high status or had some ceremonial purpose, but there's still a lot of debate about what all the symbols mean. The size of these heads is just mind-blowing. Some are up to 3 meters high and weigh around 50 tons. Imagine the skill it took to carve those. But it wasn't just the heads. They found jade figurines and a bunch of different pottery styles, which tell us a lot about their daily life, art, and even trade. The jade stuff suggests they had trade networks because jade wasn't just lying around everywhere. And the buildings. They found large structures like platforms and what might have been houses for the elite. This points to a society that was really well organized and had the resources to build big. The way San Lorenzo was laid out is also fascinating. It had a central axis, which indicates that the city was carefully planned. There were separate areas for ceremonies and living, showing a sophisticated urban structure and hinting at a social hierarchy. All this stuff from San Lorenzo has been super important for understanding the Olmecs. It's given us a much clearer timeline of their civilization and shown just how complex their society was. The variety in the artifacts, from the colossal heads to the pottery, shows that they were not only skilled in stone carving, but had artists and craftsmen who were really good at what they did. It's like San Lorenzo has given us a window into a past world, showing us how these ancient people lived, worked, and created. After the exciting discoveries at San Lorenzo in the 1940s, archaeologists turned their attention to La Venta, another key Olmec site in Tabasco, Mexico, in the 1950s. This shift was a big deal because La Venta offered a new window into the Olmec world. Known as one of the earliest complex societies in Mesoamerica, the explorations here were more focused and methodical, thanks to archaeologists like Philip Drucker and Robert Heiser. These guys weren't just digging around, they brought in techniques from other fields like anthropology and geology, giving a fuller picture of the Olmec civilization. La Venta is super important for understanding the peak of Olmec culture. The site was in its prime from around 900 to 400 BCE, a time when the Olmecs were really showing off their artistic and architectural skills. One of the standout features of La Venta is the Great Pyramid. It's not like the pyramids in Egypt, this one's made of earth and clay and has a unique conical shape. It was one of the biggest structures in ancient Mesoamerica at the time, which tells us the Olmecs were pretty good at organizing big construction projects. The pyramid was probably more than just a big building. It's believed to have been a key spot for ceremonies or religious activities, kind of like the heart of Olmec ritual life. The way they built it and other structures at La Venta, and how they aligned them with astronomical bodies, shows they were pretty savvy with engineering and astronomy. It was likely a bustling cultural hub where significant ceremonies and gatherings happened. When archaeologists started digging at La Venta, they did things a bit differently than before. They were super systematic about it, focusing on layers of soil and the context of each artifact they found. But they had their work cut out for them. The tropical climate and the fact that many Olmec structures were made of earth really made preserving and understanding these finds tough. They had to be meticulous in recording everything they dug up, which has been a goldmine for future analysis. Now, just like at San Lorenzo, La Venta is famous for its massive basalt heads. Carved from huge boulders, these heads are thought to be representations of Olmec rulers or other big shots in their society. But there's more. The site is full of altars with intricate carvings showing people, animals, and all sorts of symbolic scenes. It's like getting a glimpse into their mythology and rituals. And then there's the jade. Laventa turned up loads of jade artifacts, from beautifully carved figurines to celts. These weren't just pretty things to look at. They showed how skilled the Olmecs were and hinted at long trade networks, since jade wasn't just lying around nearby. But here's where it gets really interesting. The burial sites they found were complex, with all kinds of elaborate practices. They also found mosaic pavements made of serpentine and various offerings, which likely had deep religious meaning. All this stuff from Laventa has been super important in piecing together who the Olmecs were, their social structure, religious beliefs, and artistic talents. However, keeping Laventa in good shape for future studies is a challenge. The site's battling both natural elements and human factors, so preserving this amazing place is crucial, not just for archaeology buffs, but for understanding a key part of human history.
It'll mean a journey of 1,200 miles over rock and sand, by vehicle, camel, and on foot, and it's a dangerous journey. They call it the Land of Fear. It takes its name from the Arabic word for emptiness, Al-Zahara.
The vast area that was submerged during the end of the Ice Age has never been studied by archaeology at all. And they're not in a position to say that they know that there's no possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age, while they haven't investigated those 27 million square kilometers that are now underwater, when they haven't investigated the Sahara Desert.
When we think of the Sahara Desert, we think of endless sand. But what really lays beneath all the sand? The Sahara Desert, it's like a time machine preserving the ancient history of Earth under all that sand. The Nubian civilization, flourishing in what's now Sudan and southern Egypt, is an incredible chapter of history that's often not as highlighted as it should be. This civilization, which stretched from around 2000 BCE all the way to 350 CE, shows us just how advanced and rich in culture, architecture, and politics an ancient society could be. Imagine a civilization that lasted over 2 millennia, peaking during various periods like the Kingdom of Kerma, the Napatan period, and the Meroitic period. Nubia was strategically located along the Nile River, stretching from the first cataract in southern Egypt to the sixth cataract in central Sudan. This prime location along the Nile was not just for show. It played a huge role in establishing Nubia as a powerhouse of trade and economic activity. They were known for their abundant gold mines, which pretty much made them the go-to spot for luxury items like ivory, incense, and ebony. These goods were highly sought after in both sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, making Nubia a crucial hub in ancient trade networks.
In fact, that was one of the main arguments that the archaeological police used to try to dismiss John West and Robert Schoch. They said, show us another culture that's 12,000 years old anywhere in the world, and we might listen to you. But we know that there is no culture capable of creating anything like the Sphinx until 4,500 years ago. Therefore, of course, the Sphinx is 4,500 years ago. But of course, that changed completely with Göbekli Tepe, which is a deliberately buried site, deliberately buried 11,600 years ago.
Now let's talk about Nubia's relationship with ancient Egypt. It was nothing short of complex and fascinating. The interactions ranged from trade and cultural exchanges to outright warfare and conquests. There were times when Nubian pharaohs actually ruled over Egypt, especially during the 25th dynasty. This period is a testament to Nubia's strength and influence in the region. The kingdoms of Nubia, nestled along the Nile in what's now Sudan and southern Egypt, really tell us a story of an incredibly rich history, full of architectural wonders. Let's take a closer look at what made these kingdoms so remarkable. Starting with Kerma, dating way back to around 2500–1500 BCE, it's fascinating to think this was the first centralized state in Nubia. It was more than just a political hub. Its strategic location on the Nile made it a hotbed for trade. The architecture here was quite unique too, with large mud brick structures called defufas. Their purpose? Well, that's still something of a mystery. Were they temples, palaces, or something else? And let's not forget the artistry in their pottery and crafts, especially the black-topped red ware and their work with ivory and gold. Then there's Napata, around 1300 BCE, which really left its mark as a cultural and religious center. This is where Nubia began to exert its influence over Egypt, especially during the 25th dynasty. Think about the Temple of Amun in Napata. It wasn't just a religious site, but a pivotal spot influencing Nubian culture and politics. And the royal burials of this time, with pyramids at sites like El Kuru and Nuri, show just how much Egyptian culture influenced them. Fast forward to around 300 BCE, 350 CE, and we see the capital shifting from Napata to Meroe. This move wasn't just geographical. It signified a shift in political and cultural power too. Meroe was a hub for the arts and industry, known especially for its iron industry and the development of the Meroitic script, an early African written language outside of the Egyptian hieroglyphic system.
Part of the problem is that very ancient structures, thousands of years older than archaeologists suppose, may be hiding in plain view, surrounded by other younger structures. And the best example of that really is the Great Sphinx of Giza, and these two temples in front of it. This temple is a New Kingdom temple, much later even than the accepted date of the Sphinx, which is about 4,500 years ago. But the Sphinx and these two temples are deeply anomalous.
Now let's talk about the architectural marvels of Nubia, the pyramids. Yes, Nubia had over 200 pyramids, mostly concentrated at places like El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe. These weren't like the Egyptian pyramids we often think of. They were smaller, with steeper sides, and often featured elaborate carvings and hieroglyphics. These pyramids were royal tombs, and the burial chambers beneath them were often richly decorated. These pyramid complexes, part of larger royal cemeteries, included mortuary temples and chapels, showing a deep belief in the afterlife. The Garamantes civilization, centered in what's now southwestern Libya's Fezzan region, is a real eye-opener about how advanced ancient societies were, especially in such challenging environments like the Sahara. This area, known for its oasis environments, was crucial for sustaining life, and the Garamantes were pretty ingenious in adapting to these harsh conditions. So picture this. From around 500 BCE to 700 CE, the Garamantes were at their peak. This wasn't just a flash in the pan, it was a long period of development and stability. They were ahead of their time in agricultural techniques, urban planning, and establishing far-reaching trade networks. It's like they were the ancient masters of making the desert work for them. Archaeological digs in the region have unearthed some pretty cool stuff. For starters, they found these elaborate tombs, which really say a lot about their beliefs in the afterlife, something many ancient civilizations had in common. The complexity and size of these tombs also tell us there was a social hierarchy with different levels of wealth and status. The goods buried with the deceased give us a peek into their cultural practices and beliefs. The ruins of Garamantian cities are something out of an ancient urban planner's dream. They had organized street layouts that show a high level of social organization and civil engineering skills. What's more impressive is their water management systems. In a place as dry as the Sahara, they managed to create reservoirs and irrigation systems, which were crucial for their survival and agricultural activities. Plus, they had defensive structures hinting that they were prepared for potential threats. Now let's talk trade. They found Roman coins in the excavation sites, which means the Garamantes had trade connections with the Roman Empire. Imagine the caravans going back and forth across the desert. They also found Egyptian amulets and items from sub-Saharan Africa, showing that their trade network was vast and varied. The diversity of goods found at these sites underscores their role as a major trading hub and their interactions with different cultures.
And weirdly, up there near Cuzco, we have this curious stonework, and we also have it at Alakahoyuk in Turkey. Exactly the same kind of thing. Is this a coincidence, or is there something going on behind the scenes of history that we've not been fully informed about yet? And oddly, these patterns, these T-shaped pillars that we see at Göbekli Tepe are repeated at the Temple of Edfu in Upper Egypt and also in Peru.
Now moving on. Tassili Najer in Algeria is truly one of those places that take you back in time, all the way to the early days of human civilization. Nestled in southeastern Algeria, right in the heart of the Sahara Desert, This area is a treasure trove of history. Picture this: vast sandstone formations, cliffs, deep valleys, and rock shelters. It's not just a stunning natural landscape. These features have been key in preserving some incredible prehistoric rock art. Now let's talk about this rock art. It's not just a few drawings here and there. We're talking about artwork that dates back to the Neolithic period, some as old as 12,000 years. Discovered by a French military expedition in the 1930s, these paintings give us a fascinating glimpse into the lives of the people who lived back then. You've got human figures, wild and domestic animals, and scenes that show everything from hunting and gathering to dancing and rituals. What's really interesting is how the art changes over time, starting with wild animals and hunting scenes and gradually moving to domesticated cattle and herding. It's like a visual story of how these ancient folks transitioned from hunting-gathering to pastoralism. But it's not just about the art. Archaeologists have found all sorts of tools and pottery in Tassili Naja, indicating that people have been living here for thousands of years. These artifacts range from simple stone tools used by hunter-gatherers to more sophisticated items linked to settled communities. It's amazing how much you can learn about past lifestyles and technological progress just by looking at these objects. Now let's not forget about preserving this incredible site. Tassili Naja was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, which is fantastic because it helps in getting the support needed for its preservation. But keeping this site in good shape isn't easy. The art is facing threats from natural erosion and potentially even climate change. Plus, there's the impact of tourism. Sure, tourism raises awareness and brings in funds for preservation, but it also means more people walking around these precious artworks. When you think of the Sahara Desert today, it's all about vast stretches of sand and scorching heat, right? But believe it or not, this wasn't always the case. There's a whole hidden history beneath those dunes, and it's been uncovered through the study of fossils and isotope analysis. So let's dive into this hidden past. The Sahara has turned up fossils of all sorts of aquatic life. We're talking fish, mollusks, and even plants. And these aren't just any old fossils. They're often in great condition, which is pretty wild considering they've been under the desert for ages. These fossils got preserved because they were quickly buried under sediments in ancient lakes and rivers, which kept them safe from decay. And the dating of these fossils, it goes back millions of years, painting a long history of environmental change in the Sahara. Now, these fossils tell us a lot about what the Sahara used to be like. Fish fossils suggest there were rivers and lakes around, while marine shells hint at the possibility of larger water bodies, maybe even shallow seas. Plus, the variety of species points to a time when the Sahara was home to rich and diverse ecosystems. But here's where it gets even more interesting. These fossils aren't just found in one spot, they're all over the Sahara, which means these water bodies were widespread. Satellite imagery and geological surveys have even mapped out ancient river systems that line up with where these fossils were found. And there's a lot of variation in the types and amounts of fossils in different areas, showing just how diverse the climate and environment were across the Sahara. Then there's isotope analysis, which is like a detective tool for figuring out past climates. By looking at the ratios of certain isotopes in sediment layers, scientists can work out past temperatures and rainfall. Higher ratios of oxygen-18, for example, usually mean more evaporation, pointing to warmer, drier periods. Carbon isotopes can tell us about the types of plants that were around, giving clues about how much rain there was. This isotope analysis has been super useful in understanding how the Sahara's climate has changed over time. It's shown variations in rainfall, helping to piece together the story of how the Sahara went from lush and green to the desert we know today. And it's not just about the Sahara. This data fits into the bigger picture of global climate events like ice ages. So, in a nutshell, the Sahara's past is a lot different than its present. Once a place with rivers, lakes, and a variety of life, it's now the iconic desert. But thanks to fossils and isotope analysis, we can glimpse its green past and understand the changes that led to its current state. It's a fascinating reminder of how much our planet can change over time,